All right, welcome back to the next part of this epic saga here, where I attempt to put an NV4500 transmission with an FJ40 transfer case into my 1969 Nissan Patrol. So let me show you where I've gotten so far. All right, as you can see here, the whole thing has been fused together. And let me tell you, it was a real pain in the ass. You would think that with a custom kit from a reputable company, it should simply be a, old stuff off, new stuff bolt on situation, but it wasn't. It was an epic pain, which is why it took so long for me to put it together. It took me like a week and a half, 2 weeks. It took a full 2 weeks. Anyway, so let me show you what we're dealing with here. Before I go any further, though, I want to make a couple corrections to the last video. I said that the new input shaft that I had to install was a 1 1/4. It's actually a 1 1/8. It's the rarest of the input shafts. The reason I had 1 1/4 in my mind is because that's the most common one besides the 1 3/8, which is the beefcake right here, which is used exclusively in the diesel Dodges and the V10, Viper engine, I guess is what it is. Anyway, so that's 1 1/8 input shaft. And then I said the output shaft from the transmission I thought was like a 22 spline. It's 29 spline. I should have known that, but I had had quite a few beers at the time. It's a standard Dodge 29 spline output shaft. GM had a couple other variants that they used, but overall the Dodge and the GM NV4500s are pretty much the same. So the transmission, the replacement tail housing, that was the original tail housing that was on there, came with the transmission. This is the advanced adapters kit. That was a pain. And then we have the FJ40 transfer case back here. It's all fused together, and fair warning, there's just going to be mostly complaining in this video about what a pain it was to actually do it. But it'll be good for you to know if you're thinking about doing something like this yourself. Firstly, this thing up here was a pain in the ass. Actually, it was pretty easy once you got this off. So this is what they call a snout bearing retainer snout, something like that. And you got to get one that matches the size of your input shaft. That's the original one back there that was used with this, the 1 3/8. So now I have a 1 1/8. So I ordered both of these from Advanced Adapters at a premium. The difficult part was getting the original one off. And I'll show you some pictures if I got them, but like I had to use a screwdriver, a flathead, jam it in there, pound away on it with a hammer, and I left a lot of nicks in the face of, in the mounting surface of that transmission. And, functionally it's fine, but it was annoying how hard it was to get that thing off. After you take the 4 bolts out, I kept thinking there's got to be something else holding this thing on because it's not coming out. Watched a video of someone else taking it apart, and sure enough, you just have to beat on it and pry it until it comes out. And it's impossible not to leave scuffs all over the transmission when you do that. Once you get that off, this thing just slides right out, It locks in with these little splines, but all you do is just pull it out. And then you pop the new one in, and then you put the new bearing retainer on there. It doesn't come with gaskets or anything, so you have to just use some of that silicone gasket maker. Speaking of which, you also have to use that back here, because even straight from the factory, you can see New Venture doesn't put gaskets on their transmission. They just use silicone gasket maker. And so there is no gasket to fuse this together. You just have to do a good job with the silicone, and hopefully I did, and it doesn't leak. I got a gasket for this merger, but I still slathered it up. Same thing with back here and the PTO cover there. But anyway, let me tell you everything that was wrong with this. A, it was a pain to get that off. B, Advance didn't ship the proper hardware. Well, they hardly shipped any hardware with their thing here. So you're reusing these bolts, they have a 17 millimeter head and the thread is M10 by 1.5. And up here on the tops, and there's two more on the bottom, there's not enough clearance to use the old hardware. You try and get a socket around the 17 millimeter head and you can't do it. There's zero clearance, so there's no way to torque it down. If you use an open wrench, you hit the walls of that aluminum and you can't get anything on there. I went to Lowe's and AutoZone trying to find a Allen head version that I could use, and they don't exist evidently. And I just happened to be digging through my hardware and I found these bolts. These are heat treated grade 9 bolts with the right thread, and they happen to have a small 14 millimeter head on them, so I could actually fit a socket around it. But you can see I started grinding out to try and see if I could get a socket over the 17 millimeter, and I just didn't want to go any further because it was going way too slow, and because I was afraid I would punch a hole in it by the time I made it wide enough to actually use. The other side on the bottom was even worse. I couldn't even use the 14 millimeter head bolts. I had to grind away for almost 2 hours with a Dremel, opening this up and a drill, trying to open it enough just to get a socket around the bolt and actually be able to torque it down. So that was an epic failure by Advance, in my opinion. They should include the hardware if they know their tolerances are too out of spec to use the old hardware. It was bogus. Anyway, the other thing, and I didn't get any pictures of it and I should have, but under this there's a big nut that holds everything in here together. You got the output shaft of the transmission, you stick that adapter on there and it goes all the way out here, and there's two bearings, one here, keeps it all fused together in a big old nut. Screw it on there, holds it together. The nut that was provided by the kit from Advanced Adapters didn't work. It had a nylon gasket that wouldn't let you thread it down far enough. I was using an impact wrench trying to get past the nylon because I've used those on smaller bolts, and you can, it keeps it tight. It's basically supposed to be like Loctite, but it was so thick on that giant nut that you couldn't torque it down far enough, and there's a huge gap. Everything's flapping around. It was bogus. It still won't go down as far as it's supposed to, so I got a ton of spacers. So there's like 6 spacers and then a nut, and then the bearing, the other big spacer that you might have seen in the previous video lying around, then the other bearing. Anyway, it was stupid, and hopefully it works. Now, the biggest challenge was, I think I mentioned in the other video, you had to saw off the output shaft. You had to take off almost an inch so that it was the proper length, so that when you slid that adapter on there, everything lined up correctly in here. Otherwise, you couldn't fuse the two together. There's about an inch big gap right there. So you had to shorten it so everything would suck together. That took over 2 hours of sawing with this 15 amp cutting wheel, and then I had to go to the little handheld cutting wheel, the pneumatic one, and it was ridiculous. Let me see if I got that piece lying around here. God, I got so much crap. So much crap. Okay. Where did it go? Oh. There it is. All right, so check this out. This was the output shaft, this piece that I cut off. Maybe you should take it to a machine shop to get that perfect flat edge, but I don't want to deal with that. Get real. Why do I have all these old crappy tools, if I'm just going to take it to a machine shop? So I hacked it off myself. You can see it's pretty butch, but I cleaned it up nicely on the actual transmission. But that's just solid metal right there. And yeah, it took hours to cut through that. So you got to shorten that up, and it's almost impossible to get it right because of how hard it is to cut through. But you know what? You got to give it a try. Give it the old college try. So I shortened it up, got that fused together. That nut was lame, the hardware was inadequate, and it was extremely hard to get the retainer snout bearing dealio, bearing retainer snout off of the front of the transmission. But it's done. Everything's fused together. And if you take a look right here, it doesn't look that long. It doesn't look that long. I haven't measured it. I'm going to wait until I get the other stuff out of the Patrol and then compare the two and see how much shorter my drive shaft should be. But there it is. That's the new powertrain. It's all fused together. All I got to do is get the old crap out, put this in, you know, buy some linkage for this thing. That's probably going to run me about $300. And bada bing. So hopefully I get some more work done and I can show you what it took to get all the old crap out of the Patrol. That concludes this video. Let me know if you have any questions or anything. See ya.